Life has a way of throwing curveballs at us, and let's be honest, nobody really wants to deal with a more difficult path. In fact, most of us have gotten pretty good at avoiding the things and the people that make our lives more difficult. Maybe the reason you were even drawn to explore faith more was an attempt at finding an easier and more fulfilling life. But what if we're missing the point? What if, just maybe, God sees our struggles differently? What if the struggles that we try to avoid are there for a reason? We're talking about that today, and we're getting started right now.
What do you do when you feel like your world is falling apart? It doesn't make any sense, and you've prayed and asked God to help you with this, and it doesn't feel like He is. And I'm not saying that in those times where doubting the existence of God, although maybe that's what it did to you, I'm just saying I don't feel like He's helping me. I can remember a season that my wife and I went through where nothing felt right. And my heart was going dark, if I'm going to be completely honest. And my wife said to me, I think we need to move because this place is changing you and it's not for the better. Now that's never a good thing for someone to say to you, let alone the person that knows you best. That the circumstances that you're going through are rotting your heart and your soul. I checked my heart. Had I sinned against God? Not that I know of. Had I sinned against this other person who was making my life so incredibly difficult? And honestly, I'd set up 3 different appointments with that person and asked, what have I done to offend? How can I make this right? And all 3 times, they said, no, nothing's there. But something was there. It just, I don't know. You hear all these preachers online talk about your breakthrough's coming, but man, there was no breakthrough. And it just felt like a never-ending swamp of emotional darkness. I'm sorry to start off kind of down. My point is everybody goes through really, really bad seasons in their life. And I just wanted to know, is this my fault? And if it's not my fault, I don't even care if it's nobody's fault, but if it's not my fault, I felt like God should fix this. I didn't understand the point of me going through all of this. If all it's going to do is eat me from the inside out, I don't see how any of this is good and how this could be from God. And I didn't understand why it felt like when we prayed, He wasn't helping me. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. And our story actually starts in a farming community. And with the youngest son and a large family of 8 boys. I don't know if you're the youngest or not, but there is a youngest in my family, both in the one I was raised in and the one that I raised. And I think consistent in both, the older siblings always said that the younger was spoiled, right? They're spoiled is what they are, and sometimes misbehaved, but definitely they're a little bit crazy, right? That's what we'll say about the youngest kids. They never got to be in charge of anything because those of us who were the oldest, we were always the ones who were in charge. We were the bossy ones. They never got to tell anybody what to do, but everybody else thought they could tell them what to do. And the same was true 3,000 years ago in Bethlehem, a farming community. The 7 oldest sons of Jesse are working the farm, but the youngest son of Jesse is a little bit away tending the small flock of sheep that the family owned. And every time he left the house for the 2 or 3 days that he traveled with the sheep to find good pasture, he would take 2 things with him. He would take a sling and he would take a musical instrument. And the sling was used to fight off predators and the musical instrument was used to fight off boredom. And he got really, really, really good at both. And on one particular day, when he was out in the country, a messenger came running out to him. We don't know how long it took the messenger to get there, but no doubt he's out of breath. And he tells young David, the 8th born son of Jesse, you have to go home, and you have to go home right now. They're waiting on you. Who's waiting on you? Samuel, the most important man in the entire country, is waiting on you in your dad's living room. You have to go now." So David leaves the small flock of sheep with whoever this messenger is and runs all the way home. And that's where we pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 16. So Jesse sent for him. And him, that's David, he's young. He's dark and he's handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, dripping with sweat, smelling like a middle schooler who hadn't taken a shower in 3 days, Samuel took the flask of olive oil that he had brought and anointed David with the oil, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. What would you expect to happen next after somebody is anointed king? We just watched Prince Charles be anointed king, and so we got to see a little bit about what happens. There is pomp and circumstance and orchestras and flowing gowns and Gucci and Prada and Coach bags and gold chariots and flowing robes made of white fox fur. None of that shows up in the story of David because Samuel just leaves. Samuel's gone and David doesn't go with him. He doesn't say, "David, come with me. You're the new king." What he says is, "You're anointed the new king." And then he walks out. So David is left there with his 7 older brothers and his dad, who are probably thinking, what the heck just happened? And they wait for a little bit, looking around awkwardly. And then David is told by his dad to go back out to the sheep. And that's what he does. Goes right back out to the sheep, and life just keeps on going. And everything that he had gotten good at is about to come into play. And it sets the stage for the rest of our entire series, where we're going to be learning that God uses everything you've been through and everything you are right now going through to prepare you for everything he has planned for you next. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and the Lord sent a tormenting spirit that filled him with depression and fear. And some of Saul's servants said to him, a tormenting spirit from God is troubling you. Let us find a good musician to play the harp whenever the tormenting spirit troubles you. He'll play soothing music and you'll be well again. All right, Saul said, it's a good idea. Find me someone who plays well and bring him here. And one of the servants said to Saul, well, I know one of the sons of Jesse. He's from Bethlehem. And his son is a talented harp player. Not only that, he's a brave warrior and a man of war and has good judgment. And he's also a fine-looking young man, and the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, send me your son David, the shepherd. Now, obviously, this servant is exaggerating because David was no man of war, but he was brave. Because on at least 2 separate occasions, David had had the opportunity to use his sling and fight off 2 different predators, at least a bear and a lion. Well, the next chapter shares the second way that his past had prepared him. So one his past prepared him to be a musician for the king. Israel faces the Philistines. This was their Yankees to the Red Sox, except with a lot more bloodshed. And every single morning and every single night, one of their greatest warriors of the Philistines come out and says, rather than all of us die, why don't you send out your greatest champion to fight against me, our greatest champion? We'll fight to the death. And then whoever wins will claim victory for their entire nation. Sounds like a great idea. Everybody likes the idea of going home. But nobody likes the idea of having to be the person who fights off Goliath. So no one takes him up on this challenge. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 13. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shimea, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son, and David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army. But David went back and forth from the family farm to the front lines, so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. And we find out in a minute to take his brother food. So everybody was responsible to bring their own food. This has been a stalemate for a while, so people are sending home for food and provisions, and home is doing their best to keep up with the demand for provisions. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion stood in front of the Israelite army and taunted them. He makes this challenge. Nobody responds to it. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 17, but when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry, because when David showed up with the cheese that he had brought for his brothers and the captain of his brother's unit, he hears Goliath come out and taunt everybody. And David says, did anybody hear what he's saying? He's taunting the God of our ancestors, the God of the armies of Israel. Somebody needs to defend the honor of God, and nobody will do it. Well, the oldest brother Eliab hears David, this kid, saying, well, why won't somebody do it? Well, you're an idiot. You're a middle schooler. It's easy for you to say. Eliab heard David talking to the men, and he was angry. He said, what are you doing around here anyway? What about all of those few sheep that you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. So that's not the respect that you would expect of an anointed king. But David's life is not being lived as an anointed king. He has been anointed king, but nothing in his life has changed, and it's all about to get worse. Now, the reward for killing David is that your family would be tax exempt for all of eternity. It's a pretty good reward, or at least during King Saul's reign. That's a pretty good hookup. What you and I would both love, to get 100% of all of our taxes that we had ever paid back, and all future taxes to become exempt. And on top of that, if that wasn't enough, then whoever beats Goliath is also going to marry King Saul's daughter. Now listen to this. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 55. As Saul watched David go out to fight the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is that young kid? Abner said, I don't really know. Well, find out who he is, the king told him. And as soon as David returned from killing Goliath, Abner brought him to Saul with the Philistine's head still in his hand. And Saul said, tell me about your father, young man. And David replied, his name is Jesse, and we live in Bethlehem. So Saul had already seen David playing the harp, but he had always been part of the background. Isn't that crazy? Not even knowing that his future successor is in the room. Saul's just consumed with his own life. In fact, we find out earlier on that Saul was an arrogant man, and he was prideful, and he was dismissive, and he expected God to jump every time he snapped his fingers, and he disobeyed God whenever it was convenient for him to disobey God. He pretty much entered into this relationship with God and his people on his own terms. And whenever the terms didn't suit him, he did his own thing, which is the reason why he was such a bad person to work for. But he didn't know or care anything about David until Goliath, and then quickly came to see David as a threat. Because after Goliath had been killed, somebody wrote a new song. And here's the new song in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 6 through 9. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all of the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced with joy and excitement. Joy and tambourines and cymbals. Excitement. Verse 7. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And that made Saul very angry. What's this, he said? They credit David with 10,000 and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him king. He had no idea. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. So now David is super popular with everybody except the king. And the king also knows that David is to be his future son-in-law. So now he's going to become a royal, part of the royal household. And this is going to become a problem for Saul. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 10 and 11, the very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. And David, his future son-in-law, grabs the harp and goes back to his old job playing the harp for King Saul again, as he did every other day. But Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. So in that same day, King Saul tried to kill David twice, and he escaped. He, after this, calms down a little bit, but he's thinking, I've got to figure out a way to get rid of my son-in-law before he becomes my son-in-law. So he says he's going to give him a test, and the test is this. If you really want to marry my daughter, you also, on top of already having killed Goliath, you need to go bring me, I'm going to just say this word once, the foreskin of 100 Philistine soldiers. That's the price. And then he says to his advisors, because there's no way David can do that. My thought is if I can get him to get into 100 one-on-one battles, he's just a teenager, look at him. If I can get him to get into 100 one-on-one battles with Philistine soldiers, one of them are bound to kill him. Well, not only does David bring back 100, he doubles it and gives him 200. And it wasn't so much of a flex as much as it was a sign of gratitude. David is the eighth-born son of a farmer, and he knows I don't belong in this situation that I'm in. And if you require 100, I will do even more. I want you to know that you can trust me. But David did everything he knew to do right, but it all seemed to just come back on him sideways, and it doesn't work out. And Saul receives this and lets him, and then David says, I have no right to marry into your family. Who am I? I'm just the eighth-born son of Jesse. So he gives his daughter to another man, and then later lets him marry another one of his daughters. Actually, one of his daughters falls in love with David. And King Saul says, oh, this is very good. I'll use this to my advantage. And has her marry David instead. 1 Samuel chapter 19. David's still doing his old job. He's still playing the harp, waiting. But one day when Saul was sitting at home with spear in hand, the tormenting spirit from the Lord suddenly came upon him again. So as David played his harp, Saul hurled the spear at David. This is the second time he's done this. But David dodged out of the way, leaving the spear stuck in the wall, and he fled and escaped into the night. After this, Saul tries to kill David 9 more times. So here's my question. Who's supposed to be king? Like, was Saul the anointed king or not? Well, the answer to the question is yes, Saul had been anointed king by Samuel, just like David had been anointed. But there can't be two kings, so there's only one way for David to become king. He either usurps the authority of the current king, or he just waits until God gets rid of him. But that's taken forever. What would you do? Like if you knew for a fact it was yours for the taking. Because David did, and he didn't. So why didn't God remove Saul for King David? If David had gone straight to the throne, this I think is the answer. If David had gone straight to the throne, from being the little boy who gets exalted above his pay grade and shoots from shepherd all the way up to the king of Israel, I believe that David would have become King Saul part 2. He would have had all of the exact same problems that King Saul has. Because it doesn't matter how great of a guy David was, he would have repeated the same sin because God isn't looking, and I want you to write this down, God isn't looking for great people. He's looking for broken people. Think of the King Saul in your life. You may have asked God to remove them or to remove you, but he hasn't. Think of the tough thing that you're going through right now. And you've asked, why won't God fix this and save you from this pain? Between where you are right now and where God is taking you is a process that has no shortcuts. that is 100% true of everybody that you see in the scriptures. When God does something with a person, it's after he's allowed something to have been done to that person. And I'm thinking of Abraham, who had to make the difficult decision to leave everything that he knew in the Chaldeans and just walk until he found a place that God would show him. I think of Moses, who spent, 40 years in the household of Pharaoh, but also 40 years in the desert by himself before he ever sees the burning bush. See, everybody wants to be the one that delivers the people of Israel, but nobody wants to spend 40 years in the desert. And what I'm saying is that you don't get to the promise without the process. Like, the journey is as much a part of the plan of God for your life as the destination is the plan of God for your life. Having gone through what I went through that I referred to earlier, and I don't want to give too many descriptions about it. Looking back, I can see that all of the things that I went through during that season, only in hindsight, by the way, can I see how God has used all of that in helping me become the person I am now that I would not have been had I not gone through that season. God has a school in which he enrolls every one of his kids. And the school is 100% necessary because we aren't naturally educated in the ways of God. We think we're all set. I'm good the way I am. I got this. I'll figure it out. I don't need your help. And it's everyone else's fault. And the hardest part about this school that God takes us through is often our instructor is a person who is unbroken. The instructor is usually arrogant, condescending, harsh, unkind, and selfish. And true, when your King Saul starts chucking spears in your direction, you could pick them up and throw them right back and demonstrate to everybody how brave you are to stand up against the man, how that you are strong enough to do what's right, that you're tough, you're resilient, that you won't tolerate injustice, you will not be wronged, and that you are God's anointed, but after the order of King Saul. What do you do then when King Saul starts throwing spears at you? You do what David did. You duck. If you don't duck, then you're hit. And you can tell people who've been hit because they're bitter. They're bitter by the things that they went through. What David did is David ducked, and he actually just went right back to it. Like, he acted like he didn't see the spear. And then after he saw the spears coming, he ducked under it. And then he kept on going as though the spear was never thrown. Like, David did not allow the circumstances that was happening in the heart of King Saul to change the way that he was going to behave in the circumstances with King Saul. I think that's the difference between a King Saul and a King David. And if I'm going to be completely transparent with you, while I see myself as the King David in the story of what I went through in the past, because of the way that I reacted as a result of it and the way that I allowed it to begin to change me, I was actually becoming a King Saul myself, which I think is part of the reason why, having entered into that season of difficulty for multiple years, having asked God to take it away, he didn't, because God wasn't done purging me of the King Saul that was in me. That's what he was doing. I think there's 3 ways to duck underneath the spears that your King Saul is throwing at you. One is that you never learn and never begin to start throwing them back. 2, you stay away from other spear throwers. You don't make spear throwers a part of your inner circle. And 3, you keep your mouth shut about the spears. And I think that's the part that I struggle with the most. Especially coming out of that season, I struggled enough in that season that coming out of that season, I still had a negative physical reaction anytime I was around that circumstance or that person. Have you ever bumped into somebody from your past and when you saw them, it made you instantly feel like you had to throw up? Man, that's what this was for me. I'm going to give you something that's not in my notes. In sharing this situation with my dad after having been released from that season, but still struggling with the after effects of it, my dad said, you need to pray for that person. I said, I don't want to do that. My dad said, Jesus didn't say, pray for them if you want to. He said, pray for them if they've despitefully used you, if they've hurt you. And he doesn't say, pray for them if you mean it. He says, pray for them. And what I discovered over the course of time, and again, I told you this is not in my notes, that by the time I could pray for them to be blessed by God and mean it, was at the same time as I felt like I had been healed from the hurt that they had caused. David somehow, see, that's the thing, I dwelled on it, man. I was obsessing over the spears that they were throwing. I was upset at God that he didn't take me out of the household of the king, the mad king, who was throwing spears at everybody. And I felt unjustly served by God because I worked for King Saul, because I had the inappropriate perspective of seeing King Saul as evidence that God didn't care. If I could say anything to myself then from my perspective now, I think I would tell myself what I'm telling you now. Don't look to pick up the spears that didn't hit you and send them back. Don't spend your time hanging out with the people who are asking you more questions about your King Saul, the spear chucker. And quit talking about it to everybody else except for God. Take your concerns to God and trust him. Maybe your spouse. But don't share this with anybody else. Let God be your defender. That's what I think I wish I had said to myself. You don't know right now if the situation that you're in is ordained by God or not. So what should I do? What should you do if you feel that your King Saul is chucking spears at in your direction right now? Number one, ask God to rid you of the King Saul in your own heart. God places you under his anointed Saul to place a spotlight on all of the ways that you are starting to become like him yourself. Next, embrace the circumstances that you're in for now. 3 ways. Learn to love people who are unlovely. If you're going to be in this circumstance with this King Saul, teach yourself to be generous and kind to this selfish and unkind person. Why? Because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, to love those who do not love you, to bless those who persecute you, to be good to them. Why? Because your Father in heaven does these things for you. Number 2, discipline yourself to serve them when they are selfish. Why? Because Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount also. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 to 42, he says, if they compel you to do one thing, do that one thing and do one more. Like, be like David. He compels you to bring 100, bring 200. They force you to pick up somebody else's slack. Pick up that person's slack and one other person's slack. Like, demonstrate the honor of your character by the way you bless and serve. Like, let that shock the living tar out of them. And 3, focus on releasing them of their offenses against you quickly. And that leads me with one final thought. Then when is God going to release me from this season? When do I get a break from this King Saul? And we'll learn more about that next week. For now, I want you to focus on the King Saul that is in your life. The person who has made your life a living hell. The boss who gaslights you. It's not, what are you talking about? It's your, I don't know, this is in your head. The coworker who stole the credit for your work. the spouse who takes you for granted, the roommate who lies to your face, or the friend who shared your secret with other people in your friend group. And instead of asking God to get them, ask him to show you the ways in which you are most likely to behave like them yourself. Ask God to show you any bitterness that is right now in your heart that exists because of them or what they've done or what you're going through. Ask God to grow you through this season. I remember my dad saying, Sean, if God is taking you through this process, it's to teach you something. And if you don't learn it, when you come out of this season, he's going to take you right back into another one just like it until you do learn it. So he said, if you do have to go through crap to learn your lesson the first time so that you don't have to go through this crap again. That is fantastic advice. So your prayer is, God, if there is something that you are right now trying to show me, please, dear God, let me get it. Please let me get it so that I don't have to be taught this lesson again. Ask God to help you wait for this season after this one. And then ask God to prepare you for what he has prepared for you. Here's what I know, that God was sovereign enough to make Saul his unwilling servant and preparing David to be the only king who's described the king after his own heart. And truthfully, probably one of the most famous kings who's ever lived. So he's sovereign enough to make all of the stuff you're going through right now to work out for your spiritual development, your personal growth, your future joy, and God's greatest good also. So give yourself to God right now in this season and trust him with the process of growing you through it. Ask him, God, take me through this. I'm not asking you to I'll ask you to take me around it, but if you don't, I'm okay where I'm at. But what I'm not okay is you wasting any of this because I don't want to have to go through this desert again. Let's pray. God, I love you with all of my heart. And each one of us are going through different things. Some of us, it's just the circumstances we're in that don't have anything to do with a specific person. But others of us, God, have a specific person in our life who's making our life unbelievably miserable. And in both situations, God, we've probably at some point asked you to get us out of this, and for whatever reason, you have not. And truthfully, our hearts can become cold and hard, like mine had become when my wife said that it was changing me and I was becoming dark. Or we can do what David did. We can trust that you know what you're doing, that even though we know we're anointed for something else, we don't have to have everything right now. What I do have to have is the knowledge that what I'm going through right now is what you want me to go through. And because you are sovereign, you could change the circumstances. You can change the circumstances, but you haven't. Therefore, I trust that there's something in this season and in this situation you want me to get. So help me to get it. Help me to respond to meanness and unkindness with love. Help me to respond to selfishness with generosity. God, help me to respond to offenses with a never-ending source of forgiveness, mainly because you've done all of those things for me. And God, for those people who need those things from you, I pray that you give that to them. Maybe your prayer is, God, help me to feel loved by you. God, help me to see the goodness that is already in my life so that I can be grateful. And God, forgive me for the difficult things, the bad things that I've already done in the way that I've gone through them. Help me to become the person that you want to be and use the thing that I'm going through now to make that happen. This is our prayer. We ask this in Jesus' name, and we all say it together. Amen.
Man, well, I hope that this video was helpful for you and challenged you to shift your perspective when it comes to the difficulties that you're facing right now, or the ones that you're gonna face in the future. Remember, embrace the truth that God is with you in every circumstance. He saw this coming and he has it worked out for his glory and for your good. And when you do, you can choose to view your struggles as stepping stones on a path to become the person that God has created you to be. And if there's anything that I can do to help you in this journey or anything that I can be praying for, you can reach out to me and connect with me through the info that you see on your screen. And I'd love to support you however I can. Thanks for watching today. I'll see you again next time.